Hey guys, tonight we step into the dusty world of ancient Egypt, where the sun beats down relentlessly, the Nile's gentle murmur is a constant companion, and grain is as precious as gold. You trudge along the cracked earth, feeling the coarse sand slip between your toes, the scent of baked clay mingling with the faint aroma of ripening wheat. In this world, time isn't measured by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythm of footsteps and the weight of harvests. You probably won't survive this journey without a few blisters, but that's part of the charm, isn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's always fascinating to see where in the world we're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the edge of the Nile's fertile floodplain, the lifeblood of ancient Egypt. The land stretches out before you, a patchwork of golden fields and muddy canals, buzzing with the activity of farmers, labourers, and scribes. Grain is the currency of survival. Here wheat and barley are not just food, but the backbone of the economy, the measure of wealth, and the foundation of the pharaoh's power. The daily rhythm of life is dictated by the cycles of planting and harvesting, but counting this precious grain is no simple task. Without modern scales or calculators, the Egyptians developed ingenious methods to tally their harvests, often using their own bodies as measuring tools. You watch as a farmer steps carefully across a pile of grain, his feet marking out units of measure, each pace a silent count in the grand ledger of the land. Historians still argue whether this practice was born purely out of necessity, or if it carried deeper symbolic meaning tied to the body's sacred proportions. Some suggest that by using their feet, the farmers connected the earth's bounty directly to themselves, grounding the harvest in human experience. As you wander through this bustling scene, you notice the interplay between the physical and the abstract, the tangible grain, the measured steps, and the emerging symbols that will one day evolve into a sophisticated system of writing and accounting. It's a world where numbers are not just digits but stories, where every count has a purpose and every measure holds meaning. Remember that feeling of sand slipping between your toes? It's the same sand that has witnessed centuries of footsteps, each one a silent testament to the ancient Egyptians' relentless quest to understand, organize, and control the life-giving grain that sustained their civilization. You step deeper into the world where counting grain with your feet isn't just a quirky habit, but a practical necessity. Imagine standing barefoot on a mound of freshly harvested barley, your toes sinking slightly into the golden kernels. Each step you take is a unit of measurement, a way to tally the bounty without the luxury of scales or numbers scribbled on paper. The ancient Egyptians, masters of turning the mundane into the ingenious, used their own bodies as measuring tools, your feet becoming a living ruler. This method, known as foot counting, was surprisingly effective. You pace out the grain, each step representing a fixed length, often tied to the Egyptian foot, roughly 30 centimeters. By counting your steps across a heap, you estimate its size and, by extension, its volume. It's a tactile, embodied way of quantifying something as vital as grain, connecting you physically to the harvest. You can almost feel the weight of responsibility pressing down with each step, knowing that these counts will affect taxes, rations, and the pharaoh's coffers. But here's the quirky twist. The Egyptians didn't just use their feet, they sometimes used their hands, palms, and even finger widths as units of measure. The palm was about 5 centimeters, and the digit was even smaller. This layered system of measurement, based on the human body, made it easier to communicate and standardize counts across different regions. You might chuckle imagining a farmer measuring grain with his pinky finger, but it worked. Historians still argue whether these body-based units were standardized early on or if they varied widely, causing confusion and disputes. Some evidence suggests that local variations existed, with different towns favoring slightly different lengths. This inconsistency might have been a headache for scribes tasked with recording grain tallies, but it also reflects the organic, human-centered approach to measurement in a world before rulers and tape measures. You also notice that these foot counting methods weren't limited to grain. Land measurement, construction, and even crafting jewelry sometimes relied on body parts as units, embedding the human scale into every aspect of life. It's a reminder that ancient Egyptians saw themselves as intimately connected to the world around them, their bodies a bridge between nature and civilization. So next time you pace across your living room floor, imagine doing it to count a heap of grain that could feed a villager, fund a pyramid. It's a humble, grounded way to measure the world, quite literally, with your own 2 feet. You keep walking alongside the ancient Egyptians as their counting feet give way to something a bit more refined. The rise of measurement systems. No longer content with just pacing out grain heaps, they begin to develop standardized units cubits, palms, and fingers that will shape not only their math but their entire civilization. The cubit, roughly the length from your elbow to the tip of your middle finger, becomes the cornerstone of Egyptian measurement. Imagine a royal cubit rod, a polished piece of wood or stone, carefully marked with divisions. This tool is the ancient equivalent of your trusty ruler, but with a bit more flair. The royal cubit was about 52.5 centimeters long, subdivided into 7 palms, each palm into 4 digits. It's a neat, hierarchical system that lets you measure length, area, and volume with surprising precision. You might think this sounds straightforward, but here's a quirky tidbit. There were actually several cubits in use, common cubits for everyday folks, and the royal cubit reserved for official work. It's like having a standard and a deluxe version of the same tool. This dual system sometimes led to confusion, especially when scribes from different regions tried to compare measurements. Historians still argue whether the royal cubit was truly standardized across all of Egypt or if local variations persisted despite attempts at uniformity. Some archaeological finds suggest slight differences in cubit rods from different periods and places, hinting at a more complex picture than a single, flawless standard. The rise of these measurement systems didn't just help with counting grain, they were crucial for architecture, land surveying, and even medicine. You can almost hear the chatter of workers measuring stones for pyramid blocks, or scribes calculating the area of farmland to determine taxes. The cubit became a symbol of order, a way to impose human logic on the natural world. And here's a fun modern aside. The idea of using body parts as measurement units isn't unique to Egypt. Even today, we sometimes say an arm's length or a foot to estimate distance, showing just how deeply rooted this practice is in human nature. So, as you imagine yourself holding a royal cubit rod, remember it's more than just a stick, it's a bridge between the human body and the vast, ordered world the Egyptians were building, one measured step at a time. You find yourself peering into the shadowy interiors of ancient Egyptian granaries, where the scent of dry grain mingles with the musty air of stored harvests. These granaries aren't just storage rooms, they are the nerve centers of Egypt's agricultural economy, carefully managed and meticulously recorded. As you step inside, you notice scribes hunched over papyrus scrolls, their reed pens scratching symbols that look like a strange mix of pictures and numbers. These early accounting tablets are the first written records of grain tallies, a crucial step in transforming body-based counting into a system that could be passed down and understood across generations. The granaries themselves are impressive massive mud brick structures designed to keep grain dry and safe from pests and floods. You can almost hear the rustle of grain shifting as workers unload sacks, the soft thud of grain pouring into bins. Storage was a delicate business. Too much moisture and the grain would spoil, too little and it could become brittle and lose nutritional value. The Egyptians developed clever ventilation systems and raised floors to keep their precious harvests in good condition. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some granaries had symbolic decoration hieroglyphs and images of gods associated with fertility and abundance, like Osiris and Hathor painted or carved on their walls. It seems the Egyptians believed that divine protection was as important as physical safeguards when it came to storing grain. You might smile imagining a grain bin blessed by a god, just in case the rats decided to stage a rebellion. Historians still argue whether these accounting tablets were primarily practical tools, or if they also served ritualistic purposes, blending the sacred with the mundane. Some tablets include not just numbers, but prayers or invocations, suggesting that record keeping was as much about appeasing the gods as it was about managing resources. The scribe's role in this process cannot be overstated. They were the elite record keepers, trained in the art of hieroglyphic and hieratic script, tasked with translating the physical counts into written records. These records allowed the pharaoh's administration to track grain supplies, assess taxes, and plan for lean years. Without these tablets, the complex economy of ancient Egypt would have been chaos. So, as you imagine the scribe's steady hands and focused eyes, remember that these early records laid the groundwork for one of humanity's first bureaucracies, turning grain from a simple crop into a carefully managed resource that sustained an empire. You follow the trail from granaries to the scribes themselves, the elite few who wielded pens like swords, in the ancient Egyptian bureaucracy. Imagine sitting beside one of these scribes, their fingers stained with ink, eyes scanning rows of symbols that look like a secret code only they can decipher. These masters of writing and numbers are the unsung heroes of Egypt's grain economy, translating the physical heaps counted by feet into records that could be stored, compared, and acted upon. Scribes weren't just clerks, they were highly trained professionals who spent years mastering hieroglyphics and hieratic script. Their education began early, often in temple schools, where they learned not only to write, but also to perform complex calculations. You might picture a young apprentice nervously copying symbols, trying to avoid smudging the papyrus, while the master scribe watches with a mix of sternness and pride. Here's a quirky tidbit. Scribes often carried a writing palette, a wooden box containing inkwells and reed pens, strapped to their belts like ancient Swiss army knives. This portable toolkit allowed them to jot down notes anywhere by the riverbank, in the marketplace, or even in the shadow of a pyramid under construction. It's a reminder that record keeping was a mobile, dynamic process, not confined to dusty offices. Historians still argue whether scribes were merely passive recorders or active participants in economic decisions. Some evidence suggests they advised officials on grain distribution, tax collection, and even resource allocation during famines. Their role might have extended beyond numbers into governance and policy making, blurring the lines between accountant and administrator. You also notice that scribes enjoyed a privileged social status, often exempt from manual labour and granted special privileges. This elite position gave them a unique vantage point on Egyptian society, allowing them to observe and influence the flow of goods and power. So, as you imagine the scribe dipping their reed pen into ink, remember that their careful records and calculations were the backbone of Egypt's complex economy. Without them, the pharaoh's grand plans would have been little more than dreams, and the grain that fed millions might have slipped through the cracks. You step into the world of quirky tools that ancient Egyptians wielded to keep their grain counts straight, a toolbox that might make you chuckle if you found it in a museum today. Imagine a farmer or scribe pulling out a knotted rope, a bundle of sticks, or a tally stick, each a humble but effective way to track quantities without modern tech. These gadgets were the everyday heroes of counting, bridging the gap between the physical harvest and the abstract numbers scribbled on papyrus. Knotted ropes, for instance, were more than just ropes. They were portable calculators. Each knot represented a unit or a number, allowing you to keep track of counts as you moved through fields or granaries. Picture a farmer tying a knot for every sack of grain harvested, the rope growing longer as the day wore on. It's a tactile, visual way to count that doesn't rely on writing, perfect for those who couldn't read or write, but still needed to keep accurate tallies. Tally sticks work similarly. You'd carve notches into a piece of wood, each notch marking a unit of grain or a transaction. These sticks were often split in half so that both parties in a trade could keep a recorder, clever ancient form of a receipt. You might smile imagining a grain merchant and a farmer each holding a matching half stick, proof of their deal. Historians still argue how widespread these tools were compared to written records. Some suggest that knotted ropes and tally sticks were common among rural farmers and traders, while scribes in urban centres relied more on papyrus and ink. This division hints at a layered society where different counting methods coexisted, each suited to its context. And here's a fun fact. Similar knotted rope systems appear in other ancient cultures like the Inca's quipus, showing that humans across the globe have long turned to simple, physical tools to solve complex counting problems. So, as you imagine yourself tying knots or carving notches, remember that these humble tools were vital links in the chain of ancient Egyptian grain, accounting a tactile, hands-on way to keep the numbers flowing smoothly. You're now standing on the banks of the mighty Nile, feeling the cool breeze that carries the promise of life to the arid lands of Egypt. The river's annual flood is more than just a natural event, it's the heartbeat of Egyptian agriculture, dictating when fields are sown, when grain is harvested, and ultimately how the grain is counted. The Nile's rhythms shape everything, and you can almost hear the ancient farmers whispering prayers to the river gods, hoping for a flood neither too low nor too high. The floodwaters bring rich silt, replenishing the soil's fertility and ensuring bountiful harvests. But timing is everything. If the flood arrives late or early, crops suffer and the grain counts dwindle. You imagine the anxiety that must have gripped the people, knowing their survival depended on this annual cycle. It's a delicate balance between nature's generosity and its unpredictability. Here's a quirky tidbit. Egyptians used a nilometer, a specially designed structure to measure the Nile's water level. This ancient flood gauge was often a stone staircase descending into the river with markings indicating the water height. Officials would read these levels to predict the harvest and adjust tax expectations accordingly. You might smile, picturing bureaucrats nervously watching the water rise, their livelihoods tied to the river's whimsy. Historians still argue whether the nilometer readings were always accurate or sometimes manipulated for political or economic gain. Some suggest that officials might have exaggerated flood levels to justify higher taxes or to curry favor with the pharaoh. This debate reminds you that even in ancient times, numbers could be wielded as tools of power and persuasion. The Nile's influence extends beyond agriculture. It shaped settlement patterns, trade routes, and even religious beliefs. Grain stored and counted along its banks was the lifeblood of Egypt's economy, and the river's pulse was the metronome of daily life. So as you stand by the Nile, feeling the cool water lap at your feet, remember that this river was more than a source of water. It was the great organizer of time, labor, and grain in ancient Egypt, a natural clock that kept the civilization ticking. You find yourself tangled in the ongoing debates that swirl around Egyptian numeracy, a topic that has historians scratching their heads and occasionally raising their eyebrows. Was the Egyptian counting system purely practical, designed solely to keep track of grain and goods? Or did it carry mystical, even cosmic, significance that intertwined math with religion and magic? As you listen to these scholarly arguments, you realize that the truth might be a bit of both. On the practical side, Egyptian numeracy was remarkably effective. Their hieroglyphic numbers allowed scribes to record vast quantities of grain, land measurements, and labour contributions with impressive clarity. You can almost picture a scribe carefully etching numbers into papyrus, ensuring that the pharaoh's granaries were well accounted for. This system was essential for managing Egypt's complex economy, especially given the importance of grain as currency and tax. But here's the quirky twist. Numbers in ancient Egypt weren't just dry figures. They were imbued with symbolic meaning. The number 7, for example, was considered magical and complete, often appearing in religious texts and rituals. Certain numbers were linked to gods or cosmic principles, suggesting that counting wasn't just about math, it was a way to connect with the divine order of the universe. Historians still argue whether this mystical numerology influenced everyday counting or remained confined to religious contexts. Some scholars propose that scribes and priests saw numbers as sacred tools, while farmers and traders used them pragmatically. This duality reflects a civilization where the sacred and the mundane often blended seamlessly. You might chuckle imagining a farmer grumbling about tax assessments while a priest chants over the same numbers, seeing them as divine messages. It's a reminder that numbers can be both practical and poetic, depending on who's wielding them. So as you ponder the Egyptian counting system, remember it's more than just arithmetics. It's a window into a culture where math, magic, and daily life dance together in a delicate balance. You step into the bustling marketplace of ancient Egypt, where grain isn't just food, it's currency, tax, and power, all rolled into one. Imagine the clatter of wooden carts, the murmur of traders haggling over sacks of barley, and the ever-watchful eyes of tax collectors tallying the flow of grain like hawks. This humble crop forms the backbone of Egypt's economy, fueling everything from daily meals to grand state projects. Grain was used to pay workers, especially those who built the pyramids or maintained irrigation canals. Instead of coins jingling in pockets, you'd see ration tokens or receipts representing grain shares. It's a system that ties your survival directly to the harvest's success. You might feel a pang of sympathy for the average farmer, who not only laboured under the scorching sun, but also had to surrender a hefty portion of their yield as tax. Here's a quirky tidbit. The pharaoh's tax collectors sometimes accepted grain in kind, but also in kind of grain futures. That's right, farmers could pay taxes based on expected harvests, a gamble on the Nile's generosity. If the flood was poor, it could spell disaster, but if abundant, the pharaoh's coffers overflowed. Historians still argue how fair or exploitative this tax system truly was. Some argue it was a necessary mechanism to redistribute resources and fund public works, while others see it as a heavy burden that kept peasants in perpetual hardship. Either way, grain taxes were central to maintaining the pharaoh's grip on power. You also notice that grain as currency wasn't limited to taxes. It was used in trade, both locally and with distant lands. Barley and wheat could be exchanged for goods like linen, pottery, or even luxury items like incense and gold. This barter system, grounded in grain, connected Egypt to the wider ancient world. So, as you imagine the clinking of grain sacks and the scribes' tally marks, remember that in ancient Egypt, grain was more than sustenance, was the lifeblood of an empire, the currency that built civilizations and fed dreams. You step beyond Egypt's borders and find yourself comparing their foot counting methods with those of other ancient cultures, like Mesopotamia, where counting grain took on its own unique quirks. Imagine bustling cities with ziggurats towering overhead, scribes marking clay tablets with cuneiform symbols, and merchants using tokens to keep track of goods. While Egypt relied on body-based measures and hieroglyphs, Mesopotamians developed a numerical system based on sixtia sexagesimal system that feels oddly familiar to us today in how we measure time and angles. In Mesopotamia, counting grain involved clay tokens shaped like little cones, spheres, or discs, each representing different quantities or commodities. These tokens were often sealed inside clay envelopes, a kind of ancient security system to prevent fraud. You might chuckle picturing a merchant nervously breaking open a sealed clay ball to reveal the tokens inside, much like opening a modern-day safe. Historians still argue about how much influence these neighboring cultures had on each other's counting systems. Some scholars suggest that trade and diplomacy led to cross-pollination of ideas, while others believe the systems evolved independently due to different needs and environments. It's a fascinating puzzle. Did Egyptians borrow ideas from Mesopotamia, or was it the other way around? Or did they just both get really creative in their own corners of the ancient world? Interestingly, both cultures used counting methods that were deeply tied to physical objects, whether body parts or clay tokens, highlighting a shared human tendency to make abstract numbers tangible. It's a reminder that no matter where you are, counting grain is a universal challenge, and humans have always found clever ways to meet it. So, as you imagine scribes in both Egypt and Mesopotamia, each with their own quirky tools and symbols, remember that the story of counting grain is a global tale of ingenuity, adaptation, and the timeless human desire to make sense of the world's bounty. You continue your journey through ancient Egypt's evolving mathematical landscape, where simple counts give way to more sophisticated geometry. Imagine standing on a sun-baked field, watching surveyors pace out boundaries with ropes and stakes, their eyes trained to measure not just grain heaps, but the very land itself. The rise of geometry in Egypt wasn't just about abstract number, Sid, was a practical necessity born from the Nile's annual floods that washed away property lines and forced farmers to re-establish their fields every year. The Egyptians developed a remarkable understanding of shapes, areas, and volumes, using right angles and basic formulas to calculate land sizes and grain storage capacities. You can almost hear the rhythmic chant of workers pulling ropes taut, marking corners with wooden pegs, and scribes recording measurements on papyrus. This knowledge was crucial not only for agriculture, but also for monumental architecture. After all, the precision needed to build pyramids demanded mathematical rigor. Here's a quirky tidbit. The famous rope stretchers were a specialized group of surveyors who used knotted ropes to create right angles, a technique surprisingly similar to the Pythagorean theorem centuries before Pythagoras himself. You might smile imagining them as the original geometry nerds, their ropes doubling as measuring tapes and teaching tools. Historians still argue how much theoretical knowledge the Egyptians possessed versus practical know-how passed down through tradition. Some suggest that while they excelled at applied geometry, they lacked formal proofs or abstract reasoning found in later Greek mathematics. This debate highlights the difference between knowing how to do something and understanding why it works. As you watch these ancient surveyors at work, remember that their blend of practical skills and emerging theory laid the groundwork for future civilizations. The geometry born from counting grain and measuring fields was a stepping stone toward the grand mathematical achievements that would follow. So, next time you measure your room or calculate an area, think back to those rope stretchers pacing the Nile's floodplain, turning the chaos of nature into order with nothing but knots and numbers. You wander into a granary town, the heart of Egypt's grain economy, where the air is thick with the scent of straw, dust, and the faint sweetness of ripening wheat. The town hums with activity farmers hauling sacks, scribes tallying records, merchants negotiating deal-soul, revolving around the precious grain that sustains life and power. You catch snippets of conversation, the clatter of wooden tools, and the occasional bleat of a goat, painting a vivid picture of daily life tethered to the rhythms of harvest and storage. The granary town is a microcosm of the larger Egyptian world, where every role, from labourer to official, revolves around grain. You can almost taste the dusty bread, baked fresh each morning, and feel the rough texture of woven baskets filled to the brim. The granaries themselves are imposing structures, their thick mud brick walls designed to shield the precious contents from heat and pests. Workers move with practiced efficiency, their steps echoing in the cool shadows. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some granary towns had grain inspectors who used their noses to detect spoilage. They'd sniff sacks for that telltale musty smell, a skill passed down through generations. Imagine the importance of a good nose in a world where a single rotten sack could spoil an entire shipment. Historians still argue about how centralized these granary towns were. Some evidence points to a tightly controlled system under the pharaoh's watchful eye, while other findings suggest a degree of local autonomy, with towns managing their own stocks and records. This debate reflects the tension between centralized power and local tradition in ancient Egypt. As you stroll through the dusty streets, you notice the blend of the mundane and the monumentality everyday tasks of counting and storing grain alongside the grand ambitions of empire building. It's a world where the smallest kernel can tip the balance between feast and famine. So, as you imagine the sounds, smells, and routines of this granary town, remember that these humble places were the beating hearts of Egypt's agricultural empire, where grain was counted, stored, and cherished like treasure. You find yourself drawn into the mystical side of Egyptian numbers, where counting transcends the practical and steps into the realm of symbolism and spirituality. Imagine ancient temples adorned with intricate hieroglyphs, where numbers aren't just tools for accounting, but keys to unlocking the cosmos. The Egyptians believed that numbers held power beyond their face value. Each numeral resonated with divine significance, weaving math into the fabric of their religious beliefs. Take the number 3, for example. It symbolized completeness and harmony, often appearing in stories of gods and creation myths. The number 7, as you might recall from earlier, was sacred and magical, representing perfection and the cyclical nature of time. You might smile thinking of priests chanting these numbers during rituals, their voices echoing through stone halls, invoking cosmic order through numerical symbolism. Historians still argue how deeply this symbolic numerology influenced everyday life. Was it confined to the priestly class and religious texts, or did it permeate the minds of farmers and merchants counting their grain? Some scholars suggest that while the elite saw numbers as divine, the common folk likely used them pragmatically, though the two worlds often overlapped in subtle ways. You also notice that certain numbers were avoided or emphasized in construction and art, reflecting their spiritual weight. For instance, the layout of temples and tombs often incorporated sacred numbers, embedding cosmic principles into physical spaces. It's a reminder that for the Egyptians, math was as much about meaning as measurement. So as you ponder the symbolic side of Egyptian numbers, remember that counting grain was never just a mundane task. It was part of a grander narrative where numbers connected the earthly to the divine, the practical to the mystical. You now wrestle with the curious mystery of zero, rather. The ancient Egyptians struggle with the concept. Imagine trying to count grain heaps, measure land, or track taxes without a symbol for nothing. It sounds like a recipe for confusion, doesn't it? Yet, for centuries, the Egyptians managed their complex economy without a true zero, a blank space, or a placeholder as we understand it today. Their numbering system was additive, built from symbols representing ones, tens, hundreds, and so forth, but it lacked a symbol to indicate zero. This absence meant that scribes had to rely heavily on context to understand whether a number was missing a value or simply zero. Picture a scribe poring over a tablet, trying to decipher whether a missing symbol meant no grain or grain not recorded. It's a subtle but significant challenge. Historians still argue why the Egyptians never fully developed zero. Some suggest that their counting needs didn't require it, as their system was primarily for recording tangible quantities rather than abstract calculations. Others believe that the concept of zero was philosophically difficult, tied to ideas of nothingness that clashed with Egyptian worldviews centered on abundance and order. Interestingly, the zero concept emerged much later in other cultures, like the Babylonians and Indians, and only then revolutionized mathematics. You might chuckle, imagining Egyptian scribes grappling with this limitation while still managing to build pyramids and run a vast empire. Despite this, the Egyptians excelled in practical math, using fractions and hieroglyphic numerals to perform complex calculations. Their system was robust enough to handle the demands of agriculture, architecture, and administration even without zero. So as you contemplate the missing zero, remember that ancient Egyptian math was a fascinating blend of ingenuity and limitation, proving that sometimes you don't need every tool in the box to build a civilization. You fast forward through the millennia, tracing the legacy of Egyptian counting, as it ripples through time, influencing the mathematical systems of later civilizations like the Greeks and Romans. Imagine Greek scholars poring over Egyptian papyri, their curious minds absorbing the practical wisdom embedded in the ancient Nile's numbering system. While the Greeks and Romans developed their own sophisticated mathematics, the foundations laid by the Egyptians, especially their practical approach to measurement and geometry, provided a crucial stepping stone. The Egyptians' use of fractions, particularly unit fractions, fractions with a numerator of 1, like 1/2 or 1/3, became a fundamental concept that influenced Greek mathematical thought. You can almost see Pythagoras or Euclid studying the Rhind papyrus, marveling at how Egyptians handled division and complex problems using these building blocks. It was a methodical approach that provided a blueprint for future mathematical inquiry. Historians still argue how much direct influence Egyptian mathematics had versus independent development in Greece and Rome. Some scholars believe there was significant cultural exchange and direct learning, while others argue that the Greeks adapted ideas to their own philosophical and theoretical frameworks, making the influence more indirect. It's a classic chicken or egg debate in the history of ideas. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Romans, known for their engineering prowess, inherited much of their surveying techniques from the Egyptians, including the use of ropes and simple instruments to lay out precise measurements for roads, aqueducts, and military camps. You might chuckle imagining a Roman centurion using a measuring technique refined centuries earlier by a humble Egyptian farmer trying to re-establish his field boundaries. So, as you reflect on this enduring legacy, remember that the seemingly mundane act of counting grain with feet and later with cubits sowed the seeds for mathematical advancements that would shape the course of Western civilization. The echoes of Egyptian ingenuity resound even in the theorems and calculations we use today. You're now venturing into the realm of fringe theories surrounding Egyptian mathematics, where the line between history and speculation blurs like a mirage over the desert sands. Some enthusiasts suggest that the Egyptians possessed secret knowledge or even received alien assistance to develop their advanced counting and architectural skills. Imagine ancient pyramids not just as tombs, but as enigmatic beacons of lost wisdom, their precise measurements hinting at otherworldly origins. These theories often point to the astonishing accuracy of pyramid dimensions, the complex mathematical ratios embedded in their design, and the mysterious hieroglyphs that some interpret as coded messages. You might smile at the idea of extraterrestrial architects handing down measuring rods, or teaching scribes how to count grain with supernatural precision. Historians, however, remain deeply skeptical. They argue that the Egyptians' achievements can be explained by centuries of accumulated knowledge, practical experience, and cultural development. The idea of alien intervention is seen as a modern myth, fueled more by imagination than evidence. Scholars emphasize that the Egyptians were brilliant innovators in their own right, capable of remarkable feats without cosmic help. Historians still argue about the origins of certain mathematical concepts and whether some knowledge was lost and later rediscovered. This debate highlights how gaps in the historical record can invite fanciful explanations, but also underscores the genuine mysteries that ancient Egypt still holds. You might chuckle imagining an alien trying to teach a scribe how to use a knotted rope or a tally stick, perhaps even getting frustrated by the scribe's stubborn insistence on using their feet to count grain. So, as you explore these fringe theories, remember that while they add a splash of intrigue to the story, the true marvel lies in the human ingenuity and persistence that built Egypt's mathematical legacy from the ground up. You find yourself tracing the subtle echoes of ancient Egyptian counting in modern measurement and accounting systems, a surprising legacy that sneaks into everyday life. Imagine the humble foot, once a body-based unit in Egypt, now standardized in many countries as exactly 12 inches a direct descendant of those ancient strides across grain heaps. It's fascinating how this simple measure has endured, quietly linking you to farmers pacing fields thousands of years ago. Beyond units of length, the Egyptian emphasis on practical, hierarchical measurement systems influenced how societies organized data and resources. Their approach to breaking down complex quantities into manageable parts like the cubit, subdivided into palms, and digits Brefiger's modern decimal and metric systems. You might chuckle thinking about how those ancient divisions paved the way for your bathroom ruler, or the tape measure in your toolbox. Historians still argue about the extent to which Egyptian numeracy directly shaped later systems versus parallel independent developments. Some suggest that while direct transmission is hard to prove, the Egyptian example set a precedent for integrating measurement into governance and commerce, a model that other civilizations adapted in their own ways. Even in accounting, the idea of detailed record keeping, inventory control, and taxation rooted in grain counting resonates today. Modern ledgers and databases echo the scribe's meticulous papyrus scrolls, showing that the need to organize resources is a timeless human challenge. So as you measure your coffee cup or balance your checkbook, remember the ancient footsteps and scribbled tallies that quietly underpin these everyday acts. The legacy of Egyptian counting is not just a dusty historical footnote, it's a living thread woven into the fabric of how we understand and manage our world. You find yourself once again by the Nile, reflecting on the grain economy that shaped not just ancient Egypt, but the very course of civilization. The river's floodwaters, the farmer's footsteps, the scribe's careful records, all these threads weave together into a tapestry of human ingenuity and survival. Grain wasn't just a crop, it was the foundation upon which Egypt's society, culture, and power rested. As you watch the golden fields sway gently in the breeze, you realize that this ancient practice of counting grain with feet and measuring with cubits was more than a technical necessity. It was a way of life, a system that connected people to the land, to each other, and to the divine order they believed governed the universe. The grain economy dictated social structures, influenced religious rituals, and fueled the ambitions of pharaohs who dreamed of eternal monuments. Historians still argue about the nuances of this economy, how centralized it really was, how fair the tax systems were, and how much agency ordinary farmers had. These debates remind you that history is a living dialogue shaped by evidence, interpretation, and sometimes imagination. You might smile recalling the quirky details, the knotted ropes, the tally sticks, the grain inspectors, with their noses tuned to detect spoilage. These small human touches bring the vast machinery of ancient Egypt to life, reminding you that behind every grand pyramid was a network of everyday people counting grain, step by step. So, as you take a deep breath of that imagined Nile air, remember that the story of grain counting is not just about number sits, about the rhythms of life, the dance between nature and culture, and the enduring human quest to make sense of the world's bounty. You now turn your attention to the educational legacy of ancient Egyptian counting methods, imagining how these practices were passed down through generations. Picture a young apprentice scribe seated in a temple school, surrounded by scrolls and wooden writing boards, learning not just to write hieroglyphs, but to master the art of measurement and accounting. These schools were the crucibles where knowledge of grain counting, geometry, and numeracy was forged, ensuring the continuity of Egypt's complex administrative system. The curriculum was rigorous, emphasizing memorization, copying, and practical exercises. Students practiced drawing cubit rods, calculating areas of fields, and recording grain tallies. You might chuckle imagining a teacher sternly correcting a misdrawn hieroglyph or a botched fraction, underscoring the precision demanded by this ancient profession. Historians still debate how accessible this education was. While scribes were elite, some evidence suggests that training extended beyond the upper class, perhaps reaching skilled artisans and local officials. This diffusion of knowledge helped maintain the intricate web of economic and religious life centered on grain. You also notice that the pedagogical methods using physical tools, body-based measurements, and real-world examples mirror modern hands-on learning approaches. It's a testament to the timelessness of effective teaching techniques. So as you imagine the flickering light of an oil lamp illuminating a student's focused face, remember that the ancient Egyptian counting system was not just a set of numbers, but a living tradition, nurtured by dedicated teachers and eager learners, shaping the civilization's destiny one lesson at a time. You now explore the artistic expressions inspired by grain counting and measurement, where numbers and symbols leap off papyrus and stone to tell stories of abundance and order. Imagine intricate wall paintings in tombs and temples depicting scenes of harvest, weighing grain, and scribes at work, each image a vibrant snapshot of Egypt's agricultural heartbeat. These artworks weren't just decorative, they communicated the importance of grain in sustaining life and the divine favor required to maintain prosperity. Hieroglyphs themselves are a form of art, combining pictorial beauty with numerical precision. You might smile at the elegant way. Numbers were represented by repeated symbol strokes for ones, heel bones for tens, and lotus flowers for thousands each, carefully crafted to convey both quantity and meaning. Historians still debate the extent to which these artistic depictions served practical versus symbolic purposes. Some argue that they reinforced social hierarchies and religious beliefs, while others see them as educational tools, illustrating counting methods and economic activities. You also notice that certain motifs, like the god Osiris holding grain stalks, symbolize regeneration and the eternal cycle of life, linking the practical act of counting grain to cosmic renewal. It's a beautiful fusion of math, art, and spirituality. So as you imagine these ancient artworks, remember that counting grain was not just a bureaucratic task, but a source of inspiration, creativity, and cultural identity immortalized in Egypt's timeless art.